Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the chairman for the North Carolina Board of Transportation, Mike Fox.
Good morning. As you can see, we are moving from vision to reality at the speed of change. You'll hear this theme echoed throughout the next day and a half during our inaugural NC Transportation Summit. The first thing I want to do is thank our partner in this summit, NCGO, and also say a special thank you to all of our sponsors. This summit wouldn't be possible without your help. We encourage each of you to engage with the speakers and ask questions throughout the summit using our app. If you've not done so already, download the Crowd Compass Attendee Hub app in the App Store. Got it on my phone right here, and I was able to do it myself, so no excuses out there, but if you do need help, I'm sure some of our staff can help you. Once you're in the app, search Transportation Summit and download the event. The app will provide you with an up-to-the-minute agenda over the next 2 days, as well as allow you to participate and network with the other attendees. While I've got my phone out, let me remind everybody to put it on silent so that we're not interrupted by calls or messages. You can also participate through social media by using the hashtag NC Transportation Summit. At this time, please stand for the presentation of colors by the members of the Junior Army ROTC Color Guard from Purnell Sweat High School in Maxton from Robinson County. After the presentation of colors, please join me in citing the Pledge of Allegiance and remain standing for the national anthem by Crescent Low, the a cappella group from William G. Enlow Magnet High School in Raleigh.
March. Color guard. Hold. Left. Face. Freeze in. Arm.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Oh, say, can you see the dawn's early light?
What so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming. right, face. Come half right, march.
Thank you again, and wow, it's always inspiring to see talented young people starting off a program, and I think that's a great start to this morning. When we began discussing this summit, we were looking for a partner, one that understood how critical transportation is to North Carolina's vitality and our economic development. And so we're pleased to have NCGO as this year's partner. NCGO has been an active advocate for transportation for 18 years here in North Carolina. During that time, the chair, Marc Finlayson, has traveled the state in an effort to educate and inform, working to build understanding and to foster partnerships around transportation issues. We're glad to have Marc here today to kick off our conference and give a few remarks, so please help me welcome Marc Finlayson. Thank you, Marc.
So thank you very much, Chairman Fox. I appreciate that. On behalf of NCGO, I want to welcome you to the inaugural North Carolina Transportation Summit. It's my great pleasure to be here with Governor Cooper, with Secretary Trogdon, all of you distinguished participants and guests. NCGO is proud to partner with the NC Department of Transportation on this very new and very unique event, both in its inaugural year, 2019, and for many years to come, we hope. North Carolina has long been known as the good roads state because for decades our state was a leader in the quality of our highways, in fact, our entire transportation system. Visionary state leaders have long been committed to improving the safety and mobility of our citizens and creating a transportation system that fosters economic opportunity. However, today's steady population growth, the ravages of time on aging infrastructure, and stagnant revenue growth have put a strain on that system. And that's why this event is so timely and why the presentations you'll hear over the course of the summit are so critical in how we address the future. As Chairman Fox mentioned, since 2001, NCGO has worked to educate the public and policymakers about the challenges facing our state's transportation system, but also we've advocated for solutions. Limited funding, disruptive technologies, and a booming population are just some of the challenges that affect the safety, economic opportunity, and mobility that I mentioned. What we have to do is think beyond today and envision the transportation system of the future, chart a course to achieve it, and design a sustainable funding plan that meets future needs. For NCGO, our mantra has always been all solutions should be on the table, and we call on all of you to join us. Let's be bold, let's be creative, let's address the challenges of transportation for the future together, head on. So I want you to enjoy the summit. We look forward to working with you, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Marc. As you all know, strong advocates help us make positive changes in transportation in North Carolina, and we appreciate all that Marc does and all the members of NCGO. At this time, it's my great pleasure to welcome Secretary of Transportation Jim Trogdon. I've had the pleasure of serving with Secretary Trogdon over these past 2 years after he was appointed by Governor Cooper, and he has led the department in a transformation that is moving us forward with vision. And one thing I know all of you know a little bit about Jim Trogdon, but when Jim Trogdon says we're going to do something, we find a way to get it done. So please help me in welcoming our Secretary, Jim Trogdon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for all of your service as a dedicated leader to the Board of Transportation. Good morning. It's an exciting day. Thank you for joining us at our first North Carolina Transportation Summit, where we're going to focus on the future. And also, as the theme said, moving from vision to reality at the speed of change. But also, I want to focus on reinforcing the successful partnerships that allowed us to be where we are today. And that's all of you. Over the next 2 days, you will hear from internationally recognized experts who will offer perspectives on trends in transportation, both current and future. And I'll summarize by saying the future is not what it used to be. And to kick off these 2 days, we are fortunate to have Governor Roy Cooper welcome us. Governor Cooper was born and raised in Nash County, where he attended public schools and worked summers on a family farm before receiving an undergraduate and law degrees from UNC Chapel Hill. The governor has a profound understanding and appreciation on how transportation impacts our daily lives. From his years of service as a member in the North Carolina Senate and North Carolina House, as well as a distinguished career as our state's Attorney General, he's been serving us in transportation. As North Carolina's 75th governor, he is working to make lasting investments in our future. He wants to ensure that North Carolinians are better educated, healthier, and have more prosperous future for generations to come. Governor Cooper has provided strong support for our transformation efforts in the Department of Transportation and has allowed us to do what's right for North Carolina, not just what's easy. He has a firm understanding of how transportation opens doors of opportunities to all areas of our state, and during Hurricane Florence and Michael, he led our state's efforts to prepare and then respond to the serious and dangerous conditions that were rapidly changing across our state, as he continues to lead us forward through our recovery efforts. So please join me in welcoming the 75th governor of our great state of North Carolina, Governor Roy Cooper.
Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate that warm welcome and glad you are here. I've already gotten a couple of snide remarks about the color of my tie this morning. And truly, I reached in the closet and just grabbed anything, and I really didn't think about it and felt bad about it until I thought about that cabinet meeting one Monday morning this past fall after North Carolina State had clobbered North Carolina in football, and Secretary Trogdon shows up at the cabinet meeting with a big red tie and all of the regalia. So now I don't feel so bad. Secretary Trogdon, Chairman Fox, Transportation Board members, DOT employees, contractors, people who work in transportation, thank you for what you are doing for our state. I am excited about coming here today to kick off this conference, where I know that new ideas will be born. A lot of ideas that are happening across the country and the world will be fleshed out. And I look forward to reading the report and really sinking my teeth into this. I think it's only taken the past few months to see how critical transportation is to our public safety, to our economic security, and to our wellness. During Hurricane Florence, I saw North Carolina Department of Transportation crews, engineers, ferry operators, road crews, aviation experts, construction contractors, all left their homes as the waters rose to go to work and keep their fellow North Carolinians safe. I want to thank the tireless efforts of DOT employees, emergency management professionals, the local government officials, law enforcement and first responders who helped make these evacuations to be handled swiftly and efficiently and help position resources closer to areas that were hit hard. Good flood mapping was critical, and it helped ensure our swift response. while we continue to mourn the dozens of lives that were lost in this storm, I know that our planning and our response saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. When you step back and look at this storm, Hurricane Florence, over 2,700 roadways were damaged, over 140 bridges, hundreds of pipes, all limited mobility and restricting the flow of transportation and resources. At the height of the storm, 1,500 roads were closed, including the unprecedented flood closure of interstates I-95 and I-40. People on the east coast of the United States literally were driving around the state of North Carolina. Our DOT employees and hundreds of contractors worked rapidly to get our transportation infrastructure repaired and reopened, allowing emergency care, critical supplies, and much needed relief to flow into hard-hit communities. And today, only 12 roads remain closed because of that storm. These guys did a fantastic job, and I think they deserve a big round of applause for their work. I see a lot of faces of people that I know in this room. And long before our state suffered the blow of 2 major catastrophic hurricanes in less than 2 years, we've made advancements in our state and made it a better place to live because of our transportation. It took decades of vision and planning and determination by many people in this room to make North Carolina the good roads state. And from bridges and roads that forged connections among communities generations ago, to light rail and electric vehicles that can help our state become cleaner and stronger in the coming years, transportation is an essential part of our state's history and our future. So when I became governor, I thought about what I wanted to do. This state where I grew up, this state that I love. What could I do in my 8 years to make sure that this state is moving forward? And so, like any good CEO, I developed a mission statement, and it is simply this. I want a North Carolina where people are better educated, where they're healthier, where they have more money in their pockets, and they have the opportunities to live a more abundant and purposeful life. That is it. I tell that to my cabinet secretaries and the people who work with me frequently. I told it to a 3rd grade class a few months ago, and they really liked the more money in your pockets part of the mission statement. We all want a more prosperous state. I'm proud of the people that I've appointed and hired to help implement that mission statement. I've appointed by far the most diverse cabinet in the history of our state. I also believe that it is the most qualified, professional, and knowledgeable. We've put people in place across our state, brought them in from private industry, brought in seasoned government officials who know what they're doing. And I'm proud of the people that I have selected to help implement this mission because transportation plays a key role in all of it. We know the abilities and qualifications and leadership ability of Secretary Trogdon and David Howard, Mike Fox, the chair of my transportation board, the transportation board members that are working in a cohesive and collaborative way to help the secretary and his department. They know that it helps accomplish this mission because transportation connects people with education, with their pre-K, with their K through 12, with their community colleges and their universities. It gets people to their jobs, and it gets workforce to employers. It brings tourists to our state, which helps put money in our pockets, including our barrier islands. It gets people to their doctors and their public health departments and their emergency rooms and their hospital. It brings people the goods that they need for their families and their business. And with foresight, we are using broadband as we build out our transportation, and that provides all of these connections that I just talked about electronically and through the internet. Transportation, or should I say quality transportation, will help bring that mission into reality. I want to tell you about just a few of the steps that my administration is taking to move our state forward. First, in the wake of natural disasters like Hurricane Matthew and Florence and Michael, we're working hard every day to rebuild our state in a smarter and stronger way. We know that these storms are coming again. We have to be ready for it. Transportation is a key to helping us be more resilient against future storms. Less than a month after Hurricane Florence made landfall in our state, I announced initial budget proposals to fund recovery and resiliency efforts, in addition to funding for houses and helping small business and farmers and buyouts for homeowners living within the floodplain. I recommended money to leverage federal funds to mitigate the extreme weather effects that we're seeing on our transportation system. We are working on that now. I called for support to help develop floodgates and catch basins and things we can do to mitigate flooding. I also encouraged support for more flood mapping projects and mitigation studies and planning. And with our Office of Recovery and Resilience up and running, I'm excited because we're going to continue working with local partners and state agencies and the federal government to get hurricane-affected communities the help that they need and to keep our state safer in the future. We're also working to make infrastructure improvements that will help our rural communities and strengthen our economy for years to come. As I've traveled the state, and particularly in the rural parts of North Carolina, I've heard from employers and small business owners and residents alike that we have to have better access to broadband. It is the key to our economy. Last year, because of our good presentation and hard work, we got federal grants that will begin the largest widening effort along I-95 in decades, while also creating 300 miles of broadband at the same time. We have to think about these in a coordinated way. We've got another federal grant that will help augment bridge replacement in our rural areas, supporting agribusiness and making it easier for broadband to reach the communities that need it. I've seen farms turn around when they are able to get access to foreign markets through the internet. And we all know, because we worked on it, that Build NC has become law. That is going to encourage faster delivery for major transportation projects and help improve the quality of life and stimulate economic growth. It's going to send a message to our contractors that we are ready to do business and they can stay ramped up with their workforce because it's coming. And we've gotten the law passed, and this department has done a good job in getting those funds out on the road and making sure that we're doing the construction that we need. But Build NC is a process. And all of you, we need your help in making sure that the state treasurer, state legislators, everybody understands the importance of making sure that we keep our transportation projects financed. We want to be quicker and more efficient. The Surf City Bridge opened to traffic 10 months ahead of schedule. That's the kind of delivery process that we want to replicate in projects across our state. Infrastructure and connectivity to our economy helps us thrive, and it sends a strong message to employers considering relocation or expansion in North Carolina that we are indeed open for business. Just last month, I was proud to announce that a new business would be bringing over 140 jobs to Lenoir County. The accessibility of their location at the Global Transport helped them select that place. Broadband and a strong system of highways, rail, and aviation allows businesses to recruit and train top talent, market their goods and services, and stay competitive in our changing economy. Finally, we are taking a new approach to transportation to slow down the effects of climate change. It is here. It is affecting our weather. We need to make sure we do our part. We know if left unchecked, the effects of climate change will continue to take a devastating toll on our people and our economy. That challenge is intimidating, but it's not impossible, and those new approaches can help create better paying jobs for people. We have to work together. In October, I signed an executive order directing our state to move forward. It calls for a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions statewide by 2025. Among other directives, it calls on the state agencies, including the Department of Transportation, to lead by example, increasing the number of zero emission vehicles in their motor fleets. With more of these vehicles on our highway, we'll see less pollution, and North Carolinians will feel inspired to consider their own clean transportation options. There are a lot of other parts of this executive order to help us get there, but transportation is going to be key. Having a better educated and healthier population with more money in their pockets is not going to be easy. But if we work together, we can make progress every day, and I'm planning on it. I hope you will think of this summit as you approach it as a fresh perspective. Our world is changing ever so fast, and we have to adapt. We must plan. We must figure out the fairest way to pay for new approaches. Some of that's going to be talked about today, and we have to be brave in our efforts going forward. I think over the next couple of days, you'll hear some new ideas, some that are already being tested. You'll learn about technology and how it is reshaping transportation. You'll hear from experts about how shifting demographics should inform our planning. I think this is an opportunity to expand the way we think about transportation and how it affects the lives of people. I'm so grateful to all of you for being here. Thanks again for all of my Board of Transportation members who are out there working hard. Thanks to DOT employee Lisa Wilson, whose son Eric helps get me straight every day. Secretary Trogdon, thank you for your leadership. I look forward to the report from this great assembly here today. Let's get to work. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Governor, and thank you for your leadership to this state. Unfortunately, I've had the opportunity to spend some time with the governor during some of our natural disasters, and let me tell you, you will sleep good at night knowing that he's at the helm. Both in Greensboro in April of last year, we had a tornado come through. The governor came the next morning, and we walked through the area, and he worked hard to make sure that we had the resources that we needed there in Greensboro to take care of that. Even more impressive was during Hurricane Florence, I had the opportunity to spend some time at our Joint Operations Center over in Cary, the National Guard, and being there with Secretary Trogdon, the governor, the rest of his team, the emergency managers, the Emergency Management Director Spayberry. We've got an incredible team. And that building, you look at it and you think it's a big building and you can put a lot of people in there. Well, the parking lot was overflowing because of all the employees and the related agencies and even the volunteer, networks that come in to help after a disaster. And I had an opportunity to sit in on one of the briefings with FEMA and that the governor was leading. And I went home that night and I told my wife, I said, Angie, I said, you ought to sleep good at night, as should everybody in the state of North Carolina, because you've got a governor that's on the job, and you could see in his face and in the way he was wearing it, the concern he had and how serious he was about making sure not only were we saving lives, but that we were rapidly moving toward the quickest recovery that we could. So I'm very proud to be able to serve in an administration like that. And I want to share that with y'all so that y'all would know that firsthand as well. Couple of housekeeping notes. First, I know we've got a few people standing in the back. We got plenty of seats up here. Feel free to come up. I know sometimes it's more comfortable to stand, but we don't need anybody standing that doesn't want to. The program is in your bags as well as online, so you shouldn't have any problem figuring out where to go. And you're free to go to any of the breakout sessions that we have. So feel free to pick the one that's the most interesting to you. There's going to be multiple opportunities for you to engage with speakers at the summit. And please watch the screens for more information. And we've worked really hard, I'm taking my phone out again here, to make this summit representative of what we are talking about in the future too, which is technology. And so during our summit, you're going to have the chance to send messages, to interact with our speakers, to participate in polls. If we ask a question, you can respond immediately. So please take advantage of that, because not only will that get you more engaged, but it will make the summit a better experience for everybody. And we'll have a truly interactive experience during all of our sessions up here. Snacks are outside the ballroom, and all the meals will be in the exhibitor hall. And speaking of the exhibitor hall, I would encourage every one of you to spend some time there, because there's some amazing displays of technologies and equipments that some of which we're already using in North Carolina. Others are more forward-thinking and more innovative. And I know that you will learn a lot, and you'll have an excellent time talking to the exhibitors who are also our partners in this summit and help sponsor it as well. So please take time to go and visit with those folks. You're going to be amazed at the advancements in technology that you'll see down there. And it's going to help, frame this conference that we're having to speak about the future and what we have coming. One of the most important parts of the future is how we pay for it. And that's been an age-old problem in transportation, and we've kind of settled into a routine with the majority of our funding coming from a motor fuels tax of some sort. But we all know from reading in the newspapers and also being involved in the industry that that's ultimately a swiftly declining source of revenue because of multiple things: the increase in fuel efficiency from vehicles, as well as a transition to electric vehicles and other modes that don't use fossil fuels. So we've got to find something new. And so our first panel discussion here this morning is about preparing for the changing funding landscape. To moderate that panel, I'd like to introduce Tony Lathrop. Tony's our North Carolina Board of Transportation member from Charlotte. He's an at-large member, and he represents the area of government-related finance and accounting. Tony's a partner with the law firm of Moore & Van Allen in Charlotte, where he specializes in commercial litigation, zoning, land use, and dispute resolution. He's been a member of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Planning Commission since 2001 and has served as chair since 2014. More important to me, Tony serves as the chairman of one of our important committees, which is tasked with looking at how do we fund transportation going forward in the future. So Tony has had 2 years under his belt to study this issue, and I'm proud that he's going to be serving as our moderator for this first session. So please join me in welcoming Tony Lathrop.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everybody. I have to start with thanking Governor Cooper for being here today, for his hard work and his commitment to transportation, especially as shown through the last fall with all the work that had to be done in connection with the storms. And also want to thank the really heroic top to bottom staff of NCDOT for all their hard work during that effort. For today, also Secretary Trogdon, Chairman Fox, and most importantly, the staff of NCDOT who is making all this happen, and it doesn't just happen. So Greer Beatty and her team, thank you so much for all your hard work. And if you all see them, please give them an attaboy for that too. They're doing an outstanding job. I want to plant a seed with you all at the beginning. Please think of questions. In a few minutes, we're going to do a panel here, and the audience is a huge part of that. So as we're going through this and what you've heard so far, and all of you are experts in your space in the transportation field, we want your questions. So please keep those in reserve and be ready when we call for them. I'm honored to be chosen to moderate this panel on how to prepare for a changing funding landscape. As finance chair of the Board of Transportation, I work closely on an ongoing basis and checking in regularly on the finances of the department, the cash balance, the revenues, et cetera. And so this hits home to me every month. Unfortunately, our two U.S. DOT folks, Anthony Bedell and Brandy Hendrickson, couldn't come because of the shutdown, and we'll miss them. And they're very insightful and good folks, and we'll hope to have them another time. But we're fortunate to have today two of the most knowledgeable federal transportation experts in the country, Jim Tymon, who's the new executive director of AASHTO, and Rob Puentes, the president and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation. Before we get going with that panel, I'd like to take just a couple minutes to frame up this discussion. First, I want to start with just a quote, and you may not know who it's from, but I'll reveal afterwards. And here it is. When we first built our highways, we paid for them with the gas tax, a highway user fee that charged those of us who benefited most from the system. It was a fair concept then, and it is today. But that levy has not been increased in more than 23 years, and it no longer covers expenses. So that's the end of my quote. And there may be some folks here who are up on their transit tax history who know that today that number is not right. I misspoke. They may think that figure of 23 years is incorrect. Actually, the federal gas tax has not been amended in 36 years. And so you folks who caught that are on point. I was quoting remarks made by President Reagan in 1983 upon signing the legislation that raised the gas tax at that time. Much like 1983, the gas tax remains a fair form of taxation, but it is, I'm going to use a strong word here, it's a dying tax. And by dying, I mean that the research is showing that the level of revenues coming from the gas tax are flattening out and may start to decline in the next decade. Factors that are involved in that decline are increased fuel efficiency, the rise of alternative fuels and electric vehicles, and simply changing commuter patterns of folks driving. Folks are just finding other ways to get where they need to be. So part of the conversation, a significant part of it here, is talking about alternatives to the gas tax. So funding for transportation is coming to a crossroads. The federal FAST Act expires in 21 months. The next authorization bill is going to require an infusion of $89.9 billion, I'm going to call it 90, to continue current, just keep where we are for the next 5 years. A strong transportation infrastructure, as you all know, is the backbone to a vibrant economy and to the citizens of this country. And especially here in North Carolina, we need more from Congress than just these current levels. And what I mean by backbone is that transportation infrastructure is absolutely critical for economic opportunity, as well as economic development, but to me, it's economic opportunity. We got to move freight and people through all modes of transportation, not just cars. With respect to economic opportunity, we're talking about connecting people to their jobs, their education, their health care, for tourism, connecting rural to urban, urban to rural, vice versa, region to region, mountains to coast, seaports to airports. And in that vein, talking about corridors. We have radiuses of economic activity around centers of economic opportunity in North Carolina. And transportation infrastructure is key to expanding those radiuses and keeping them from shrinking as they start to get stopped up. We've got corridors, when I say seaports to airports, running from our ports all the way to the mountains. And those are corridors of economic prosperity. But we've got challenges and opportunities to grow them through our transportation infrastructure. We've got to continue to keep North Carolina the great place it is to live, work, and raise families. We've got to stay competitive with the states, with the cities across this country that are competing with us every day. My parents used to say to me, Tony, if you're standing still, you're moving backwards. And we don't want to move backwards. So why exactly do we need more? The American Society of Civil Engineers has identified a $1.1 trillion funding gap for surface transportation between 2016 and 2025. AASHTO's bottom line report found that funding for public transit needed to increase from $17 billion to $43 billion to improve conditions and meet our nation's mobility needs. 44% of America's major roads are in poor or mediocre condition, and U.S. motorists pay around $599 per year each. I'm going to call that $600. In the aggregate, that's $130 billion a year in extra vehicle costs for repairs and operating costs due to the condition of our roads. 45% of our major urban interstates in the U.S. experience congestion during peak hours. Traffic congestion alone costs American motorists around $170 billion a year in wasted time and fuel costs. So it's not hard to justify the need for more funding for all modes of transportation. So the big question is, and we've got to get this conversation going, what does the future hold? There are a lot of different ideas about that, what we're going to do as we approach a funding cliff. But people of goodwill, smart people, stakeholders need to have that conversation so that we don't run up to the edge of that cliff and fall off, that we're prepared and get out in front of that. So I want to start our panel now. What I want to do is first introduce Jim Tymon from AASHTO. Jim's the executive director of AASHTO, which is the long name is the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. Nonprofit, nonpartisan group that supports and represents the interests and missions of state departments of transportation. Before his appointment as head of AASHTO, Jim was their chief operating officer and their director of policy and management. He previously, before that, served as the staff director of the Highways and Transit Subcommittee of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and served as that committee's lead staffer for the development of Map 21 and Safety Lou. Please help me welcome Mr. Jim Tymon to the podium.
Thanks, Tim. Welcome. Thank you. Appreciate it. Good morning. Oh, wow. Usually you don't get that kind of response, especially at 10 o'clock in the morning. Well, thank you for having me here. I'm not sure if Tony mentioned how new I am in my job, but I actually just started, I guess, 8-9 days ago. My first day on the job was January 1. But I'm really excited to be here. This will actually be my first address to a group like this as executive director. But as Tony said, I've been with AASHTO for a while now. I started about 5 years ago. I oversaw their policy shop, our policy shop at AASHTO, really working with the state departments of transportation around the country to make sure that what's going on in Washington, D.C. reflects the needs of the state departments of transportation. We work very closely with all of the states. In North Carolina, I'm proud to say, has been a very active member really for our entire history, over 100 years within the organization. We're happy to have Secretary Trogdon as one of our board members. He's very active. He represents you all very well. And that really does put you gives you a seat at the table as a state as we deal with a lot of the federal issues that we'll be talking about here over the next hour and a half. So I want to talk a little bit today about the importance of federal investment in surface transportation. A strong federal surface transportation program is vital to the economic health of our country. And at the foundation of those federal surface transportation programs is the Federal Highway Trust Fund. For those of you who are not familiar with the trust fund at the federal level, although I'm sure most of you are, it's supported primarily by the gas tax. It's an 18.4-cent gas tax. And that brings in about $35 to $40 billion a year in revenue. The problem that we're having at the federal level is that we're spending about $50 to $55 billion a year from that trust fund. So you guys wouldn't be able to operate your checking accounts that way, where you're only bringing in about $35 billion a year, but spending $50 billion a year from it. But the federal government has been doing that. We've been doing that for about 10 years now. And the problem that we're facing with the Federal Highway Trust Fund is that we're drawing a disconnect between it being primarily funded by the federal gas tax, a user-based system, and we're injecting general fund dollars from general tax revenue into the trust fund in order to keep it solvent. Again, we've been doing this for about 10 years. We've moved about $140 billion over 10 years into the Highway Trust Fund from the general fund to keep it solvent. And that means that we're competing on a regular basis with other programs for those dollars. So rather than relying on a steady stream of revenue that comes into the trust fund to support these vital federal programs, we're having to compete with other programs, whether it's housing or defense or anything else like that, labor, education, any of the other federal agencies that you can think of that are currently closed. We're actually competing with on a regular basis in order to prop up the Highway Trust Fund. So how did we get here? Well, the real problem is the fact that the gas tax that supports the Highway Trust Fund hasn't been increased since 1993. So we do an analysis at AASHTO, and we try to track different things and the cost and what they're, how they've increased over the last 25 years. So one of the things that we look at is college tuition. So we're here in Raleigh, and we did a little bit of an analysis, and we looked as, do we have anybody that graduated from NC State in the last, or let's say 25 years ago? All right, do we, any idea what tuition was in 1993 at NC State? It's about $1,500 a year, just for tuition and fees, not room and board, for $1,500 a year. You know what it is today? About $9,000 a year. So think about the increase in the cost of tuition from 1993 to what it is today, and think about the fact that the federal gas tax was 18.4 cents 25 years ago, and it's still 18.4 cents now. That's not the way that the price of different things go, and that's really the way that we're pricing the value of transportation at the federal level. We've kept the funding source for these programs the same over the last 25 years, despite the fact that the cost of doing business, the cost of building these facilities and operating them and maintaining them has increased substantially over those 25 years. Now, the good news is that Congress likes to spend on transportation. They just don't like to pay for it. And as a result, we have this imbalance where we need about $15 billion a year to come out of the general fund in order to keep the Highway Trust Fund solvent. But I'll tell you that I don't see that as a sustainable path moving forward. We are going to need some type of a long-term fix to keep the Federal Highway Trust Fund solvent. This idea that we'd have to go back to the general fund every year or every 5 or 6 years if we're doing a long-term surface transportation bill and have to really beg for additional money and compete with these other programs isn't something that it isn't the way the programs have been operated over the last 60 years. And if we have to get into that situation where we're continuing to have to come to the general fund and compete for dollars, I worry that we won't do as well as we've done recently in being able to really keep a similar level of spending as we've had in the past, but prop it up with general fund dollars. For those of you who are wondering, well, what if we didn't get those general fund dollars? What happens to these federal surface transportation programs? Well, essentially, we have a long-term surface transportation bill right now that authorizes the federal surface transportation programs through 2020. And if we don't reauthorize those programs and find additional funding for the Highway Trust Fund, the federal highway program is going to drop to less than half its current level. So the amount of money that North Carolina gets through the federal highway program would be cut in half, and the amount of money that goes out through the federal transit program would go almost to zero. We'd essentially have to drop those programs back to those levels in order to allow the Federal Highway Trust Fund to kind of to refill itself, to collect revenue at a higher level for a year or two, so that and not spend as much as we've been spending. And then you would be able to line up revenue with the payments that we're making from the trust fund. But even that is, like I said before, about a $15 billion cut. So you'd be cutting back on what we're currently spending at a time where we really need to be investing more. I truly believe that investments in our transportation network really pay dividends from the economy standpoint. We see this on a regular basis as states are out there competing to bring businesses into their state. We hear a lot about the transportation packages that they put together to make sure that if Toyota or Nissan or Ford wants to relocate a factory or a manufacturing facility in their state, they're always coming to the table asking, well, what can we do to improve the transportation network around that facility so that I can make sure I can get my goods to market? So that's a great example of just one of many reasons why we can't afford to cut back on transportation spending if we really feel that we want to continue on the economic glide path that we're on now. I want to talk a little bit, like I said, about the gas tax, and I've said that we haven't increased it in 25 years. It's currently at 18.4 cents. In order to get it to a level that would support the level of spending that we have right now at the federal level, we'd have to roughly double it, which is a huge ask for folks, and we recognize that. But the fact that it hasn't been increased since 1993, if you had indexed that rate in 1993 to inflation and adjusted it every year, we would have more than enough to cover the spending deficit that we have in the Highway Trust Fund. But we recognize that Congress is it's going to be a tough lift for them to go in there and possibly double the rate of the federal gas tax. So we also are supporting other options out there. There are a lot of other ideas out there, and one of them is a vehicle miles traveled fee. As our fleet becomes more fuel efficient, and as we start to shift to different ways of powering our vehicles, the actual usefulness of the gas tax in funding our federal transportation programs is starting to deteriorate. So as a result, one of the concepts out there that's being considered is to charge folks on a per mile basis for how much they drive. The gas tax is really a proxy for that now. When you fill up your car, you pay an amount into the Federal Highway Trust Fund based on how many gallons you put in, and that is really an estimate on how much you drive and the amount of use you're putting onto the system. So moving to this concept of a VMT is something that's being studied right now. There are several states around the country that have statewide pilot programs where they've asked for volunteers to sign up for folks to be able to let the state know how much they've driven, and then they kind of get a fake bill that would show how much they would be charged if they had actually paid or were being charged by the mile. And we actually have some regional pilot programs, including one on the I-95 corridor, that we're seeing how we can work between multiple states to implement such a program. But there are a lot of challenges associated with that. Probably the number one political challenge around that is the privacy concerns. There are a lot of folks out there that are very concerned that if we go to a mileage-based user fee system, that the government would be tracking where they go and what they're doing. I actually put my phone down, but usually, oh no, I didn't. At this point, usually I pull out my phone and say, well, if you're carrying around one of these, or if you're using a credit card, your whereabouts are pretty much already known. But we understand that that's a hurdle that we're going to have to get over if there is going to be a nationwide VMT approach. That's something that is going to be looked at. I think in the next round of surface transportation reauthorization, it's going to be one of those things where we look at maybe a nationwide pilot program where people can volunteer to be part of that experiment. But it's something that isn't going to fix the Highway Trust Fund today. It's something that's more likely to be that we're looking at in 10 or 15 years. So we still need some kind of a near-term solution to fix the Highway Trust Fund in order to make sure that the foundation that these federal surface transportation programs are built on will actually continue to exist. Some people like to say that, well, maybe it's time for the federal government to get out of the business of funding federal surface transportation. We absolutely disagree with that notion. There's been a federal-state partnership for over a century now in building, operating, and maintaining our nation's transportation network. That system has worked very well. We believe in it, and we want to see it continue moving forward. There have been, I think it's 28 states now and the District of Columbia over the last 5 years that have increased their state gas taxes. They've successfully gone out there and either worked through their state legislator or have had the voters actually vote on a referendum to increase the gas tax, and that's been very successful at the state level. But that doesn't mean that gives Congress the excuse not to address their issues. They still need to come to the table with a robust federal surface transportation program that helps the states and localities build, operate, and maintain their transportation network. It's important to say that of those 28 states that increased their gas tax over the last 5 years, it's been a mix of types of states. You've got red states and blue states that have come to the table and that have really taken on the tough task of raising revenue in order to invest in their transportation network. You've got states like Tennessee and Utah, as well as states like California, that have gone out there and increased their gas tax, whether they are traditionally Democrat states or Republican states. They've gone out there and said, we're going to do what's right for our economy, for our transportation network, and we're going to increase funding or increase revenue to make sure that we can address some of the needs that Tony mentioned that are out there for the transportation system. Let me talk a little bit also about the federal program and where we're at today. I know a lot of you are aware that we have a federal shutdown right now for about a quarter of the federal government, and that is having some impact on the transportation world as well. From a Federal Highway Trust Fund standpoint, the good news is that a shutdown like this does not have an impact on the Federal Highway Trust Fund. Our federal highway employees are still at work. They're out there and they're able to make sure that the money is continuing to flow out to state DOTs so that they can continue the projects that they're currently working on. But one of the problems that we're seeing right now is that we don't have a full year appropriations bill for FY 2019, so states aren't able to plan for the projects that they had hoped to put forward this year. So as we get into the warmer part of the year and construction season starts to ramp up, we have states that have a lot of uncertainty around not being able to implement their program as they had planned. We're now more than a quarter into the federal fiscal year, and states only have a quarter of their funding. If Congress were working under what's called regular order, the entire allocation of federal funding would have gone out to states on October 1st, and that would have allowed states to essentially implement their transportation program and plan their projects for the entire federal fiscal year. Now here we are over 4 months into or 3 months into the federal fiscal year, and we only have a quarter of the federal funding out to all the states, and that's starting to impact that. We heard from Oklahoma yesterday, who said that they're pulling back on bids that they were planning to put out in January and February because of the uncertainty associated with the federal program. So while it's good news that the Federal Highway Administration is open for business and the money continues to flow, it's upsetting that Congress still isn't able to get the work that they need done to get these appropriations bills across the finish line so that all of the federal surface transportation funding can get out there and be put to work and be invested in projects. I will say it's not the same good news for our federal transit programs. While a lot of those programs are funded out of the Highway Trust Fund, the staff and the administration is not funded out of the Highway Trust Fund, and as a result, most of the folks at the Federal Transit Administration are furloughed and not there to actually administer those programs. And then you're seeing that as well with other programs, whether it's the capital programs at Amtrak or FRA, or the capital programs at the FAA. Those programs are not operating either. Now, air traffic control and some of these other essential activities like safety inspections on rail and for commercial motor vehicles, those will continue. But a lot of the capital programs outside of the Highway Trust Fund are not necessarily moving forward. So with that, I'll be happy to sit down, and then we can, I know we have some questions lined up for later. Thank you.
Thank you. Well said. Thank you. I want to thank you very much, Jim, for those insightful remarks and for your directness and candor with what's needed at the federal level. I think that's a critical part of our conversation, and we've got to have a lot more good conversations. Before we move on, I want to just make a couple quick announcements. Greer Beatty, who is our lead staff person for this, tells me that we've had over 100 walk-in registrations this morning, which is evident by this full room. And so they're going to be moving some more chairs in, so we appreciate y'all's accommodations while we're adding seating. Second, we are a little bit ahead of schedule, so we're going to have time for everybody to see our vendors downstairs. Please make a point to see all of those if you can, or as many as you can. There's some really interesting, very, very cool things to see down there, so I commend that to you. So now I would like to move ahead and introduce our next speaker, Robert Puentes. Robert is the president and the CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation. The Eno Center is a nonprofit think tank with the mission of improving transportation policy and leadership. Before joining Eno, Rob was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program, where he directed that program's Metropolitan Infrastructure Initiative. He's currently a non-resident senior fellow with Brookings, in addition to his duties at Eno. Before being at Brookings, Rob was the director of infrastructure programs at the Intelligent Transportation Society of America. He has worked extensively on a variety of transportation issues, including infrastructure funding and finance, and city and urban planning. Rob, we all look forward to hearing what you have to say. If you all please help me welcome Robert Puentes to the stage.
Welcome. Thanks very much. Thank you, Tony, for that. Whoa. Sorry. Good morning, everybody. I think one of my mics is on, maybe. Sound all right? Well, thank you again. I'm really humbled and honored to be here. What a tremendous turnout for these transportation events. We're doing a lot of these all around the country, as I'm sure Jim and others are, and we're seeing the same kind of energy and enthusiasm, so I'm really happy to be here today. And I'm really happy to be out of Washington. I don't know if you've heard, it's not a really healthy place right now. I may not ever go back, as a matter of fact. But despite the nonsense that's happening in Washington right now, despite all the hand-wringing that's going on, particularly from a political level when it comes to transportation, it really is an exciting and dynamic time to be working in transportation. I've been in this field for a number of years, as you heard from the very long bio, and I can't remember a time where there was so much energy and innovation and new ideas and enthusiasm for things that were going on right now. I don't want to be naive. We have tremendous challenges. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But it's really, really exciting, and I really want to congratulate you for holding this event, for bringing folks together, and for having the state step up and do what you're doing here today. So congratulations for all of that. I want to just start a very quick introduction for who I am at the Eno Center, and I'm trying to get to my slides. Don't know where they are. If someone can help, I'd just looking for the first Eno slide. But the Eno Center for Transportation is a public policy think tank. We're about 100 years old. We were founded by Mr. William Phelps Eno, who was the inventor of the stop sign. He was the first traffic engineer in the world. He was living in New York City, looked down and saw that there were vehicles and horses and trolleys and things that were kind of interacting with one another, and he figured out, well, we need to set the rules of the road. We need to figure out who should be where and how we should organize ourselves. And he created this institution about 100 years ago. And I'm trying to stall while I find my slides. We'll get to there in just a second. But we are right now the only think tank in the United States that's focused on all modes of transportation. So we're talking a lot here today about surface transportation, highways, and transit and everything else. But we deal with aviation, freight, the whole panoply of things. We are based in Washington, D.C., but we do work outside of Washington, particularly with cities, states, and metropolitan areas all across the country. And we do it with the public and the private and the nonprofit sectors. So we obviously don't do all of that at the same time. The remit is very large, but trying to focus on those areas where we can have the most impact and and be relevant to what's going on all around the country. Those slides look good? Oh, there we go. Now we're back up. Sorry. See, this is what happens when you bring these stupid PowerPoint presentations. But as we go around the country and as we think about what's happening in transportation today, it's very dynamic things that are happening because this is a very dynamic time in the country's history. There are urban historians who look at what's going on today and say, we haven't seen changes like this in 100 years, from the demographic changes that are going on, to these globalization complexities, to environmental concerns, climate change, resiliency, technological innovation, the political and the funding problems. All of these things have happened before, of course, but they've never really happened all at the same time. So nationally and all throughout the country, this is an amazingly dynamic time. Therefore, it's an amazingly dynamic time in transportation. Transportation, as we all know, is a means to some kind of end. It's not the end in and of itself. It's designed to facilitate a lot of different things around the country. And as we're experiencing changes in globalization, that impacts freight. As we're experiencing changes with the environment, that impacts vehicles. As we're experiencing changes with technology, that impacts others. So all of these things are derivative of these larger changes that are going on right now. So that's why it's probably a really exciting time today. But there's, of course, a whole bunch of different challenges. And as we go around the country and we talk to folks, there are a bunch of common themes that are occurring. It's a big country. Everything is not uniform from coast to coast. But there clearly are some common themes. Clearly, the rehabilitation and the maintenance of the existing system is a common theme. We've heard that already today. Just the need to maintain and upkeep the infrastructure that is in place today is a major topic of conversation, particularly in older parts of the country like the Northeast and the Midwest. And I know the conversation here in North Carolina is about accommodating new growth and new infrastructure, but still rehab and maintenance of the existing system is still obviously paramount. Traffic congestion is still a major concern in cities and states and metro areas all across the country. I think we're starting to move away from kind of some of the old technologies and the old approaches for how we were going to address traffic congestion. It's kind of here to stay, and it's kind of a byproduct, an unhappy byproduct, there is, of a growing economy. So, I think I'm hitting this by mistake. Addressing things like pinch points and addressing kind of specific areas where freight bottlenecks occur and things like that is really where the transportation conversation is going when it comes to issues around congestion. Climate change is clearly a major issue. Transportation, again, is the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases all around the country. Now it's more than buildings and other things. So when we think about how the transportation is going to address that, we have to think about things like vehicles. We have to think about things like demand reduction, obviously big and important all across the country. Safety is the next thing on there. Obviously, we're still losing about 30,000 people each year due to traffic accidents all around the country. When we think about what a national crisis really looks like, this is probably one of them that we should be talking about much more. Safety is paramount from coast to coast. And accessibility, making sure that people are able to use the transportation network to get to jobs and economic opportunity and be able to foster their own well-being. Too many people right now are stuck, and a lot of that is a transportation problem in addition to other things as well. So all of those things are happening around the country, and there's a lot of common themes, but the big question that we're seeing from place to place is how are we going to pay for the infrastructure that we need today? We know what the challenges are. We know what the needs are. Places like North Carolina have a tremendous list of projects that they want to put in place. They have a tremendous amount of needs, ambitions, ideas that they want to put forward, but we have to find the resources in order to pay for the infrastructure that we need. As Jim said, I think we do need to have a strong and reliable federal partner. When we think about things and we have stats like Tony mentioned at the beginning, was $1.1 trillion in infrastructure needs all across the country. And these numbers are huge. They're just so gigantic that people think, well, that problem is so big, only the federal government is the one that can deal with that. And indeed, the administration has talked very strongly about infrastructure and transportation. Congress has talked about it. There's a whole bunch of competing things. So the conversation is alive and well in Washington. The challenge is that we haven't really moved on it right now. But we do need to have a strong and reliable federal partner. They have to be able to lead in certain areas where only the federal government can be present, things that are just too big in scope, not necessarily in cost, but things that just span the continent, aviation, freight, right? Things like this need to have the federal government be present and strong. We need the federal government to devise policies that, so we don't have 50 different ones, like around autonomous vehicles. We don't want 50 different autonomous vehicle policies all around the country. So you need to have the federal government present in a whole bunch of areas. They also need to, though, empower places to experiment and innovate. As I said, there's so much new things that are going on around the country. The federal government, in some ways, should provide that flexibility to kind of get out of the way and let places experiment, relax it a little bit, things like tolling on the interstates. Maybe there are places that have new ideas that can do it a little bit better. Let's let them free up for proliferation of new ideas. And then they have to maximize those investments that are being made. As I said, we have to have the federal government present, and we have to make sure that the money that's being spent is being spent in the right way. Data collection, things like this is really important for the federal government. The problem, though, is kind of what Jim was alluding to and was talking about, is that we are facing some grim realities here in the near future. The last couple of years have actually been pretty good when it comes to transportation funding, for reasons I'll talk about in just a second. But we're facing some obstacles that are going to prevent, are going to require some new thinking. So I'm going to get wonky here for just a second. It's important to think about, and Jim was talking about this as well, there are two types of federal funding. There's discretionary funding, and then there's mandatory funding. We'll start with the mandatory on the top there. The mandatory funding, as Jim was saying, is the things that the government has to spend because there are things attached to it. So this is all the entitlement programs, Social Security, pensions, Medicaid, things like that. But it's also transportation-related programs like the Highway Trust Fund and the Aviation Trust Fund. So those are the things that they have to spend because there's money coming in, and that's the way that Washington is organized. Those issues that Jim was talking about are going to be coming up and are going to be coming to roost here in just a few years. We'll talk about that in a second. The second area is around this discretionary funding. This is where Congress decides that they want to supplement existing spending in different programs. They have different caps that they put on the spending, and that's kind of a big political conversation that's going on right now. They split that into defense and non-defense. Almost all the transportation and infrastructure stuff is in non-defense. The problem, then, is that we have issues on both sides. Jim talked about this, that the mandatory spending, Congress has authorized more money than it knew was coming in, kind of assuming that somebody eventually was going to raise the gasoline tax. We'd take care of this problem. That hasn't happened in a long time. So Congress has to find about $20 billion in perpetuity to keep just the existing spending levels going off into the future. So Congress is going to have a big role in that. The discretionary side, this problem is going to arrive much sooner because the funding, the budget deal that was agreed to that gave us a lot of money in recent fiscal years is getting ready to expire. They're going to have to figure out some new budget deal in order to raise the caps and things like that. We could talk about some of the wonky stuff in a second, but it's important to recognize that there are two different things that are going on, and those good times that we've had for the last couple of years are at risk. So this kind of illustrates what we're talking about with both the discretionary and the mandatory side. The mandatory is on the bottom, discretionary at the top. You can see with the mandatory, the gas tax revenue that's coming in, other revenue that's going into the trust fund, is keeping it at a pretty steady pace. The discretionary at the top, obviously you can see the cliffs when Congress has put in, or the peaks that Congress has put in there with that big cliff that's coming up in just a fiscal year or two. This slide illustrates the challenge with the discretionary. Again, this shows the base cap levels where the federal government is, or where Congress has authorized, has appropriated money to be spent, and then these budget deals that are on top of that. You can see those last two there at the end, illustrating how much money has gone in to pay for transportation in recent years, and then the big cliff that we're going to be facing coming up soon. And this last slide then will illustrate the problems happening with the mandatory spending. You can see, as I was illustrating, the outlays, which is that top line, far outpacing the revenues that are coming into the trust fund. This goes out off into the future, and you can see we're going to have huge gaps, 20 billion plus in future years facing. So I don't mean to be very sober and to bring everybody down, but there are enormous problems that we're facing on the federal level right now, which I'll talk about in a second. The good thing, though, is that there is a lot of things that are happening around the country. While this is not ideal, it doesn't mean that places are sitting around waiting for Washington to act. It would be great if Washington did act. Washington should be acting. Washington should be addressing these problems with a lot of urgency, the urgency they're putting to a lot of other areas, but they're not doing it right now. But in the meantime, that doesn't mean everybody's sitting around waiting for Washington to do something. For one thing, I think that states and localities are the ones that are going to continue the innovation, are going to continue to put things forward. And right now, there is an insatiable demand as we go around the country from places to learn from one another. They know what the problems are in Washington, and they heard that things are happening. Well, tell me about what's happening in this place. Let me bring that idea back to my city. Let me bring this idea back to my state. Let me tailor it. Let me learn from mistakes, and let me craft those solutions that meet the realities of our place. It's really exciting in that way. I'm going to touch on just a couple of these and hit on a couple of themes that Jim had already kind of dealt with. One is around the gas tax. So the gas tax is politically toxic for some reason in federal Washington, but as Jim said, it's not politically toxic outside of Washington, and red states, blue states, and everything in between, as he mentioned. 27, 28 states have raised their tax in just a few, in just recent years. There are a couple of places that are starting to look at it now. North Carolina was actually one of the most recent ones to raise their gas tax, and we've seen just this year Alabama and Mississippi officials talking about raising it in their place. So there's something very strange going on when the conversation in Washington is as stonewalling as it is right now, but in states all across the country, you see a very, very different thing that's happening. I don't know what happened to Hawaii on that map, but Hawaii should be on that map too. They have not raised they're not one of the states that raised their gas tax. The other thing Jim mentioned, which is really important, I think, for folks to consider, is that places are starting to go directly to the voters and asking them to raise money for all kinds of different transportation projects. This is not a substitute for what's happening in federal Washington, and the administration, although they're encouraging this and they really want to see cities, states, and metros pick up some of the things they're doing and really replicate a lot of this stuff, this is really more of a supplement and a complement to what a strong federal program should look like. Nevertheless, we do see about 75% of these things pass every single election day. We've been tracking this at ENO for a couple of years now. We tracked all of them last year because these don't just happen in November, they happen all throughout the year. And when voters are asked to raise money for transportation projects, time and time again, they're willing to do that. They're willing to pay out of their own pocket to pay for a range of transportation projects. Again, this used to be something that was very common in the Intermountain West and some of the newer places that have a history of doing this, but we saw this all across the country this year, in the Northeast in some places. We saw it very strongly in the South. Georgia does this very routinely, and here in North Carolina, we even saw a couple of places that went to the voters asking to raise bond issuances for transportation projects. Now, I know that's kind of routine, but the point I'm trying to make here is that this is going to continue, and we already know that there are a whole bunch of places that are lining these things up for 2020 when we're going to have a big national election, as everybody knows. The other thing Jim mentioned I want to hit on is this issue of the vehicle miles traveled charge. This is getting a lot of attention for lots of good reason. We recognize the unsustainability of a gasoline tax as vehicles become more fuel efficient, as driving habits are starting to change. We probably should be raising the gas tax now, but in the future, we should be looking for something else. And so the vehicle miles travel charge is getting a lot of attention, and there are a lot of really successful pilots that are happening in cities and states all around the country. Oregon has had a very successful and long-standing test. A lot of other countries have had these VMT charges in place, particularly for trucking. And what's interesting now is that places like Tennessee have already put one of these in place. They've restricted it to autonomous vehicles because there is no constituency right now to be upset about it. But it's probably a pretty smart idea. If we think that autonomous vehicles are coming down the pipe, let's figure out a way that we can put this in place now so that nobody's going to be complaining. And when it is there, it'll start to pick up the slack that we're seeing with the gap on the regular gasoline tax side. So Tennessee has this in place. I think Massachusetts is looking at it, but a lot of other places are looking at it. And we think about attaching a VMT charge. Autonomous vehicles are probably the right place to look, given how high tech they are now, and given that it's a natural connection between those two things. The second thing I wanted to mention is that there are a lot of other cities and states and localities that are engaging in new kinds of partnerships to get things done. As I said, the traditional way that we've put together projects is starting to change, and places are trying to do whatever they can to innovate and to build the new kind of projects they need. One thing I like quite a bit is what's happening in Northern Virginia on Interstate 66, right outside of Washington, where the state engaged in a public-private partnership to widen this very, very congested freeway, to have the public sector, or to have the private sector in this case, be able to generate revenue from the tolls that are going to be collected. They're still going to be free lanes, but now they're going to be toll lanes. They're going to take some of that revenue, they're going to put it into public transit, and the taxpayers aren't going to pay a dime in this case. I like this particularly because the state knew what it wanted to do in this case. It knew it had to address this Highway 66 because it's very congested, it's chronically crowded. The state knew what it wanted to do. It needed to fix these bridges. It needed to put money into public transit. And they said, it's going to cost us X amount of hundreds of millions of dollars. If you're a private sector company, you want to come in and do it for us? Go ahead. If you can beat it, you can do it. And if you can't, then we're going to do it ourselves. Some private company came in and said, we need to get into that market. They beat it, and they have this thing underway today. So it's a really great example of having a state know what it wants to do and a private sector that was willing to engage with them. Another thing that's happening around the country, and this is another Washington example, is this issue of value capture, which is very common across the world in places like Japan, where real estate and transportation, all these investments are very tightly close together. We don't really have good models for that here because this is not Japan, this is not Singapore, places like that. Nevertheless, we have an American style that's starting to emerge, like what happened in Washington, D.C., with this infill kind of station that ran through a previously neglected neighborhood. The private sector came in and said, hey, if we had a transit stop there, the value of this land will go up tremendously. We'll pay for this transit stop. They came in, they paid for it. That's an area the city wanted to redevelop anyway, and it's now the fastest growing metro stop on the system. It's a tremendous success. Those kind of examples, those kinds of new, unique innovations that are truly American are starting to appear all across the country. The last thing I want to mention then is that I think there's new styles of transportation service delivery that are starting to emerge. I know you've all seen the Lime scooters and things like that. They're all around Raleigh. These are all around the country right now, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I think we're going to start to experiment, and you're going to see Lime scooters. Maybe you're not going to see them in 6 months. We had dockless bikes in Washington for a long time, then all of a sudden they disappeared. So we're going to go through this churning for what these new mobility options are going to look like. But it's a really interesting time because the private sector has started to recognize that all these things that we're talking about here today are actually a business opportunity for them. People want to be mobile, people are willing to pay for it, and people are looking for a whole bunch of options. So transportation as a service is really starting to proliferate all around the country. And these new kinds of partnerships between the public and the private side are becoming much more common. And I'll end with just a last one about this because I think that people automatically think, well, this is, if the private sector is engaged in these areas that were traditionally public sector transportation, that we're losing something as the public sector. I don't necessarily think that's the case. There is no doubt that the public sector has to stay involved in making sure that they are adhering to public policy goals, that they're protecting people, that it's universally shared. We're not just supporting the certain segments of society that can pay for it. We actually should be addressing public policy concerns for people who can't afford it, can't pay for it. But all this is starting to change right now, and there's new actors that are emerging, and it's a really exciting time in that way. So let me just end then where I began. I think it's an interesting and dynamic time in transportation. Tons of ideas, tons of innovation. Some of that is coming from Washington, but I think most of it is going to come from people like you who are here in the room today. People who recognize that the financial and political challenges ahead are really complex and they're ready to address those problems. People who are working to better define the federal and state and local roles, which are also changing. And people who understand the role of the public and the private sector as well as the partnerships between them. I want to thank you all for having me here today. Sorry for the PowerPoint problems. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Rob, for those insightful and direct and candid remarks. We're going to get to some questions here, as I stated when we started a little while ago. So we're going to need your questions, so be thinking of those, please. I neglected, I want to give a shout out to the NC Metro Mayors group in Bo Mills for their help in pulling this together. And Bo, you may see Bo scurrying around taking pictures today. He's everywhere. I want to also now take a short change in direction from this. We're going to do a Ask the Audience poll. As Mike Fox mentioned, you all have the app on your phones. And so we are going to do, with the help of my technology folks, I'm going to put a question to you, and I think that you get to this poll in the app on your phone, and so I'm going to give you a couple minutes to do it, and then we're going to go over the results. So it's a 3-question poll, or a 3-part poll. The base question is, what do you think is the most effective way to ensure future investments for NC's transportation needs? It's indexing. 1 is indexing existing fees and taxes so that they'll rise. Identifying 2, in identifying new taxes and fees. Or 3, a combination of both. So if y'all will do that now, and I think the results are coming up. Maybe they're going to play some Jeopardy-like music while you vote. I don't know if you can see. 0? Yeah, 0 for indexing. Current. All right. I can't see the raw number very well, but 91 is for the combination, and what, 9 and 9 for the second one? Yep. So there you have it. That's I think that's a valid statistical number to get. That's over 10% of our audience sample here, so that's a pretty valid sample. So thanks for participating in that. And before we do some questions, I want to thank the staff for that technology. I think that's very interesting stuff. So thank you all very much for facilitating that poll, and thank you all for participating. So I'm going to start. What I'm going to do now is have a couple questions for Jim and Rob just to get it going. And then they've got some mics out here. So, and there's also a way for you all to submit questions through the app as well, I believe. So I'm going to sit down and then start the questions, and we'll get it going. I'm going to start with one question for both of you guys. And that question is, what do the two of you see are going to be the biggest changes in the transportation landscape over the next 10 years and the next 20 years? Rob, why don't you start?
Thanks. I mean, clearly technology is at the top of the list. I've been at ENO now for about 3 years, and I don't think a day has gone by where we haven't talked about things like autonomous vehicles and all the tech that we talked about here already. So I don't think there's any question that we are facing a transportation technology, well, revolution, evolution. There's a lot of debate about that, but clearly things are changing, and technology has an awful lot to do with that. So that's one. The other, I think, is this change that's happening, which is a shift from mobility to accessibility. I know that sounds kind of wonky, but we've spent a lot of time in the past moving around people and vehicles, and we measured things around that. How fast can we, what's the velocity of movement, and how fast can we move vehicles through an intersection, things like that. We're starting now to measure, well, the purpose of the transportation system is to give people access to something. What does that actually look like? And we're starting to put those accessibility measures in place. It gives us a really good notion about how well the transportation system is performing, since that is really what we're trying to accomplish. I know North Carolina has a new priority system for projects. I think this is starting to seep in, and it sounds like something that only a policy wonk would care about, but it could have transformational effects on the networks.
So I would agree that technology is probably the number one driving factor on how things are going to change over the next 10 or 20 years, whether it's the incorporation of autonomous and connected vehicles into the fleet, or really how state DOTs are using technology to better operate and maintain their existing systems. So, we have tools at our disposal now that we didn't necessarily have 10 or 15 years ago, and you're seeing more of that technology be incorporated into the everyday functions of state DOTs. One area where this is going to cross, I think, with funding, you're seeing with electronic tolling. It's making it a more viable option for a lot of different facilities. You don't have to necessarily put up toll booths and cause that additional congestion, and it seems to make it a more publicly acceptable option for folks if you're able to do electronic tolling, and we're seeing that here in North Carolina on several facilities, being able to experiment with hot lanes or just greenfield development where you're building a new facility, but being able to roll it out with electronic tolling as opposed to setting up actual toll booths with which the electronic tolling helps the facility operate more efficiently. But again, I think this connected autonomous vehicles and what role they'll play as part of the fleet moving forward, I don't think it's a 10-year issue. I think it's more of a 15 to 20-year issue. We are going to see vehicles become more connected and autonomous, but we're probably at least 10 years away from seeing a real impact on the fleet for them to be truly autonomous, where you can kind of sit back in a vehicle without a steering wheel. You'll see those vehicles start to come out, but the penetration into the fleet is, I think, more on the 10 to 15-year range as opposed to the next 2 to 5 years.
Second question. Some states are not waiting on the federal government to increase transportation funding. 31 states have enacted transportation packages since 2012. So this is a two-part question. One, how will the share of federal to state funding change? Do you see that? How do you see it changing? And second, what are your recommendations to the states in light of that to address these transportation funding challenges?
Well, I think both Rob and I discussed how, states are stepping up to the plate and raising revenue for transportation, whether it's an actual gas tax increase or other revenue sources. States have, since 2012, really shown that they can get the job done at the state level. One of the things I think that concerns a lot of us in Washington is, does this give the federal government an out to kind of walk away from their responsibility? And we certainly disagree with that approach. We think that the federal government should continue to essentially occupy the same role that they have in the past. And really, at the end of the day, it's about a 50% investment that comes from the federal government on capital projects. And we think that the federal government should continue to be that level of a partner, that they should be providing about 50% of the funding for these types of projects. They can't do it with the current revenue mechanisms and the way the programs are set up right now, especially since states are increasing what they're doing. So the federal government is going to have to take a hard look at their programs and their revenue sources and try to figure out how can they step up the same way that the states have over the last 5 or 6 years. The good news is I think that there is an appetite in Congress to have this discussion. I mean, you've seen with the new Congress coming in last week, they're talking about infrastructure investment. It seems to be one of the top priorities that they have. And I truly believe that infrastructure is an area where Democrats and Republicans can come together and try to get something done. You know, there's a lot of dysfunction in Washington, as is evidenced by what they're going through right now with the government shutdown. But I do think transportation is an area where they can come together. We've seen this in the past. The last couple of long-term surface transportation bills that have gotten done, you've seen kind of leaders that are almost on the far right and the far left of their parties be able to come together as co-sponsors of major transportation bills and get them done. So maybe this year, if Congress doesn't get a whole lot else done, maybe they're able to find a way to get a large-scale infrastructure bill done. And we're hopeful that if they take on an infrastructure package this year, that they look at the Highway Trust Fund, that they try to find a long-term, reliable source of revenue that provides the trust fund with the money that it needs to operate the way it should, so that it's able to fund the programs not just at the current levels, but it's able to increase the amount of money that goes into those programs the same way that states have increased what they're putting into their state transportation programs.
Agreed. I think that it is an area where we might see some bipartisan agreement this year. I don't think it's a substantive problem. I think it's more of a political problem, just given the political problems in Washington right now. But last year they passed an aviation reauthorization, so I mean they did something last year, so there is precedence for this. And in terms of the first part of the question, I don't think that states are raising gasoline taxes because the federal government isn't necessarily. I think that they've always had these in place. The state gas taxes actually are older than the federal gasoline tax. There may be, though, some new urgency that's coming up. I think that because these conversations are happening in many, many different places, states are recognizing that there is a different level of urgency, you know, in these days than it was a few years ago. So there may be a different fire that's lit. But I don't think there's anybody, and Jim would know better than anybody, whether or not states are saying, well, Washington's not going to be here, we're going to take it ourselves. They still need a strong and reliable partner to be there. What that does to the shares, I don't quite know. I think that we know this administration is looking at all of that, and there are different formulas and things that are grading projects, whether or not they give more or less state money coming in or local money. But maybe that is where the new ideas are. So if we identify what a federal program would look like, a national, maybe there are projects that are so important to the national government that the national government is going to put more money in, 80, 90%, whatever it is, because they meet some other kind of criteria, but we haven't really identified that yet on the federal level. The federal government hasn't really identified what the purpose of the program is. Let's just say it's freight movement because of the globalizing economy, just as an example. If that was what the federal government wanted to do, then we'd start to orient projects all around the country. Freight movement, ports, railroads, whatever it is. That's just an illustration to show you that there's got to be some connection between the projects that are being funded and whatever we're trying to get out of it. If the federal government was going to do that, then you'd have to see them step up and probably take a bigger share of those costs.
But I would say that that is on top of what they're already currently doing. I mean, right now, the bulk of the money through the Federal Highway Program and the Federal Transit Program goes out to states and localities through formulas. And then the states and the localities are able to choose which projects are best suited for their areas. That fundamental nature where it's this federal-state partnership where the money goes out through these federal formula programs and then the state decides which projects are best suited. I think that needs to continue. You still need a strong federal partner for those formula programs. And then on top of that, it would be great to see the feds step up on some of these projects or these issue areas that are clearly in the federal interest, that are interstate travel, interstate commerce related, some of these big projects that aren't getting done that are having an impact on the nation's overall economy. And there are a lot of those projects that you can point to throughout the country, and we have some discretionary programs right now where the U.S. Department of Transportation is accepting applications from states and localities. They review them, and then they They put money out on the street. North Carolina was just a recipient of one of those large grants back in December. And that's a great process, and that's a great additive to the kind of foundation which we need to continue, which is that formula program approach and that federal-state partnership.
Well, your answers piqued one more question in me that I want to slip in before we go to the audience, and because it's a real interest of mine. And when you're talking about investments in infrastructure, I'd like to know your feelings about what the return on investment is in those investments. Do you have a mental formula that you use, or because anecdotally to me, I think it's tremendous. When we're talking about the impact on people's lives and the economic opportunity, et cetera. But can you speak to that?
It's a great question. It comes up, I think, all the time because people are trying to figure out, well, how do we quantify this? We have all this data. How are we getting the best bang for the buck? And it's hard. It's really hard to do. At the end of the last administration, the Treasury Department put out a report that listed 30, maybe 40 projects where they tried to do this. And they tried to look at, well, what is the return on investment going to be really for the projects Jim was talking about, big things that meet some kind of measure of national significance, not local projects, but corridors and other things that were just that were large in scope. And they found in every case that these projects had a positive return on investment. The point of the report was trying to say, yes, these are going to be very expensive projects, multi-billions of dollars all across the board. But if we do that, it has this direct economic return. Trying to build the case for that, it came at the last end of the administration and really nobody paid much attention to it, but that's the kind of thing that we need the federal government to be doing much more of, making that empirical case that these projects actually do pay off in the long term.
Yeah, and I agree with what Rob's saying. What we hear more about, though, are the negative impacts for not investing in transportation and what that does to the economy. And clearly, it's a key factor for economic growth and economic well-being, not only just within a particular state or local area, but nationwide. And as I mentioned earlier, we hear these anecdotes all the time about how states are competing with each other to draw businesses in. And transportation is always a part of that equation. The private sector is always looking to the public sector for, well, what can you do for us in order to make your area more attractive as opposed to somebody else that they're competing against. Rob and I are both in DC, and we just went through this whole HQ2 approach for Amazon, and a huge part of the proposals that those final 10 cities were putting forward, there were transportation components. And I think that demonstrates how important transportation is to economic development and economic well-being overall.
Thank you. That's great information. All right, it's y'all's turn. It's time for questions from the audience. I don't get the electronic questions submitted directly to me, but we've got microphones, and maybe Greer or one of my colleagues will get to me the electronic questions that y'all are submitting. All right.
Well, thank you. My name is Steve Rao. I'm a senior member of the City Council in the town of Morrisville. And first of all, I want to thank Secretary Trogdon and the DOT staff for doing such a great job making sure that cities in North Carolina are getting their roads funded. And I just want to thank the DOT. We have a great process in North Carolina where we go through the strategic funding formula, STIP, and we get funding. So you've given me some great ideas on public-private partnerships. My question has to be with looking at it from a city perspective. We often in our plans as towns are looking at road widening projects. Even in Morrisville and Wake County, we're growing 65 people a day are being born in this county. So we're putting more and more cars on the road. So to what extent is there an opportunity for towns to be looking at more aggressive investments in transit as a way to take cars off the road? And I don't know, the reason for my question is there's some critics that say that even if you widen a road, that you're going to be putting more cars on the road. And I'm not sure if transit, like if we had more bus service in Morrisville, more frequent service, are there studies that show that that would take traffic off the road. And I just would like to get your insight on that I could take it back to my colleagues on the council. Thank you.
Well, there's a school of thought that if you have the assumption of really rapid population growth, that if you widen the roads, that within a certain amount of time, a couple of years, 5 years, that at peak time the road is going to be back where it started, and so in terms of being stopped up. So I think what you're talking about is giving folks alternatives to that rush hour commute, or folks that don't have a car or don't want a car to get to their opportunities, their economic opportunities, their health care, their education, and to keep that radius around your town from shrinking. So that's just my 2 cents, but I want you all to chime in.
Well, this is an issue that states and localities around the country are struggling with. And I think what you're seeing from a state DOT perspective is that, state DOTs are no longer departments of highways. We actually, our last holdout from a state DOT community that was a highway department changed their name to transportation last year to reflect the fact that states are taking a multimodal approach to their transportation challenges. I think it's more of an all of the above approach. It's how can we move people and goods in the most efficient way and give people the choices that are necessary, that fit their specific situation. So 5-10 years ago, we were faced with declining vehicle miles traveled. And there were a lot of folks out there that said, see, this is the change that we are going to be seeing moving forward. People are driving less. Well, now we look back and see that was really due to the change in the economy. The economy was suffering and people were driving less. Now the economy is improving, and we see VMT growing at a percentage that is more traditional and more of what we had expected. Part of the driving force behind an increase in VMT is also population growth. Even if we saw a change in behavior among people where they were looking for more alternatives, whether it's kind of on that micro mobility side from a scooters or bikes or active transportation, or if it's traditional public transportation, we're seeing population growth that is going to drive VMT growth up regardless of the change in behavior. So I think we need to take all of those things into account. Again, I think state DOTs are doing a great job of thinking system-wide and making sure that they're investing in the right projects that move people and goods, as opposed to just saying, we need to expand this highway. They're saying, what's the best use of the money that we have to make sure that we can most efficiently move people and goods from point A to point B?
And does it the right way. I think that you can waste a lot of money on transit if you don't do it the right way. Exactly. And if it's just make it up, it's a 4-lane arterial that's going between 2 places, and you decide, well, we're going to run transit on that, probably not going to be very attractive for people, right? Because maybe it's not an accommodating place to walk around or to be on transit or to have a bus stop or anything else like that. So people will always take the most reliable, cheapest, most efficient. Very few people, I think, are choosing their transportation mode based on the mode itself. They're going to do whatever they have to do to get where they got to go, and if we're going to make it easy for people to drive, that's how they're going to get there. So I think transit needs to come with other options. If you're really trying to transform cities and towns in North Carolina, transit alone is not going to do that. It's got to be part of a larger package, and I think you've got to keep in mind, too, that as Jim was saying about driving is up, transit ridership across the country is really, really down, right? Yeah. There is a plummeting in transit ridership. A lot is in some of these mid-tier kind of cities and metros where the transit system is an option of last resort. People are using it because they have to use it, and we certainly should have that as a public policy goal, as a social service. But if we really want transit to make a big impact and do what you're saying and take vehicles off the road, it's got to be part of a transformational effort within these cities and towns, because transportation and development and now and land use is all tightly related. So I guess the short answer is just don't have just a transit conversation, have a larger conversation about what you want this town to look like and the role that transit has in that new vision.
Rob brings up a great point in the shifting and driving being up and transit ridership being down and how it was flipped 10 years ago. I mean, changing nature of what we're going through from a transportation standpoint, it's hard to keep up. I mean, technology is one of those driving factors. I think that one of the reasons that you're seeing a decline in transit ridership in some of the urban areas is the availability of some of the ride-sharing options that are out there. I mean, we've seen some in Washington, D.C. where they have other issues within the D.C. transit network, but I think one of the factors is that they have other options, whether it's using Uber or Lyft or using one of the scooters or some of the bike share options that are there. People aren't just using the traditional public transportation options. And those options really weren't there 5 years ago. And it's interesting to see that how quickly the landscape is changing, just transportation in general, not just in funding.
And where transit is up is in places that have started to do that, have that larger vision. Houston, Seattle, I think Oklahoma City, in different places around the country where they've taken it out of its traditional box and made it part of a larger transportation vision for their cities.
Thank you. Next question. Trying to see. I see one back here. Okay.
Hi, I'm Bill Dush from Concord. You made a statement about the last part of HQ2 was dealing with transportation for the HQ2 for Amazon. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what that included? What was included in that part of it? Thank you.
Well, those proposals from cities were pretty tightly held across the board, but a lot of the information that we were hearing was that Amazon was looking for a connection to transit. They wanted an area that had walkable options for folks to be able to, almost like setting up their own campus. I think that you saw a lot of the proposals, let's just say from Maryland and Virginia, that were heavily committed to investing in improving the transportation network around the proposed sites in order to attract Amazon into their cities. So, I don't have anything specific. Again, we can talk, what we saw a little bit, I think, from being in the DC area, what was the investments that states and localities were willing to make in their networks in order to draw Amazon to the sites that were on the table in Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. And again, all of them have a transportation nexus. They wanted to be close to transit. They wanted to have a variety of different transportation options. And I think really that's where we're trending in general, is people want options. They want to be able to pick a place to live or a place to work where they have the ability to get to or from work in different ways. And certainly I think we saw that with the Amazon experience.
Cully. I'll repeat it, so you go ahead.
I come from a business background, and in business, we relied heavily on annual strategic planning, so that there would not be the surprises, and we would not just be reacting, but we would be able to plan for stuff that we saw on the horizon. In Washington, within your companies, and within the Department of Transportation, are they relying, or do you do real strategic planning where you sit and analyze and look to the future and try to visualize what's going to happen and make plans and lay plans? Is that really taking place?
So the question is, it's from Cully Talton, NC Board of Transportation member from Blowing Rock, about the role of rigorous strategic planning year over year with respect to transportation.
No. I'm being flip. We, in the early 90s, I think, was the last time the federal government really had a clear vision for what it wanted the transportation network to look at and the role of the network in the national landscape. I think the federal government probably at the time maybe was out in front of the states. I think right now the states were way out in front of the federal government. I think if we did what you're talking about, and I'm policy wonk, this would be a dream, right, to do exactly what you're saying, we would be able to build that support then for a robust network right now. Right now, it's kind of a black box. And this is the point about the gas tax, I think. The reason that states are able to raise their gas taxes in legislatures, at the ballot box, and elsewhere is because they're articulating what they're going to do with that money. We're going to raise the gas tax, and then we're going to do this. And voters say, that's great, I want to go for that. We don't have that in the federal government, on the federal level right now. It's the things that, it's these hand-wringing things. We have a deficit, we have a problem, it's negative, 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 and if you just raise the gas tax, trust me, it'll all going to work out. We don't have a vision, but it's all going to work out. That's untenable right now, and I think that's the number one reason why we haven't been able to get that political support. So to the short answer, I think that, yeah, we would love to be able to do that and to have a real serious conversation strategically about where we're going as a country and the role in transportation in that, and then craft a program around that. We absolutely should have that conversation. The problem is we have politics in Washington, and that we're not doing nothing, but politics is pervasive right now.
Yeah, Rob is right. I mean, we don't really have that at the federal level. I think our organizations have that. I know we have a 5-year strategic plan that we put together, and we try to follow that and follow the goals and the visions that we lay out in that strategic plan. I think the closest thing that we have at the federal level from a surface transportation standpoint are those long-term authorization bills that really set the funding stream for states and local transit agencies for a 5 or 6 year period. We were lucky to get one of those bills done a few years ago in the FAST Act, and that really provided a level of predictability for states and local transit agencies to know how much money they'll be getting from the Highway Trust Fund over that 5-year period. It fixed the Highway Trust Fund for a short term, getting us into 2021, but we're going to be faced with a funding cliff when that bill runs out, and we're going to need essentially, another $150 billion from the general fund in order to prop the trust fund up again if they decide not to raise revenues from other sources like the gas tax. And that type of unpredictability is already starting to make folks in the transportation committee the community nervous. Transportation projects, especially big ones, are going to stretch out over multiple years. And you like to know where, if the federal funding makes up half of funding for these capital projects, you like to know where half of that money is going to come from over that time period. So we're hopeful that Congress starts working this year on reauthorizing a federal surface transportation bill, that they're able to provide that 6-year predictability that's necessary starting in 2020. That this way states and transit agencies can take on those large projects that are going to take multiple years. One thing I do want to mention that we haven't talked about yet, and it speaks to a level of unpredictability. Built into the FAST Act was a rescission of money that we're going to be faced with here in about 18 months. We play a lot of budget games in Washington, D.C., and one of the ways that Congress was able to get the FAST Act done was to say, hey, we're going to authorize this level, but in the last year of the bill, we're going to actually take some of that money away in order for them to meet the budget caps that they had to meet. And as a result, states are looking at a rescission of about $8 billion next year. And that is making us in the state DOT community extremely nervous, because that's going to have a real impact in individual states. States that have programmed some of that money for projects already are going to have to either find alternative sources of revenue and funding to move those projects forward, or they're going to have to take those projects out of the plan and look to do them at a later date. We're hopeful that Congress addresses this rescission that we're going to be facing here in the next year, and really takes it and eliminates it, because we were told kind of on the front end, oh, don't worry about it, Congress will address it later. Well, here we are, and we're going to be faced with this in about a year, and it's going to have real impacts within the state DOT community if that rescission isn't addressed this year.
Mr. Secretary.
I'm going to ask this question hypothetically, and you'll play a role to answer it. So, Jim, I'd like for you to be the lead bill sponsor in the Senate, working for the Senate Majority Leader. And Rob, you'll be the House bill sponsor. And this bill will be, how do you transform transportation over the next 20 years to bring it back to the Eisenhower days of robustness? But if you're the lead bill sponsor, what would be the core principles? What would be your revenue source? And what would be the likelihood of you getting that passed through Congress in the next 5 years?
You want to go first, Rob?
Oh, sure. I'm glad to be in the House.
Me too, Nancy.
You have to, I think for something that is truly transformative, to use your words, that it would have to be connected to some other larger area of national policy, whatever we're trying to achieve. The Eisenhower is a great example. We're trying to improve national defense and get farmers out of the mud. In the ICE-T legislation in the early 90s, it was about multimodal and kind of this new modern system. We've got to articulate that new vision for whatever we want this big, massive, and really important program to be, and then align everything right under that. And so then if you're just transportation people, talking to transportation people about transportation things, we're going to get transportation outcomes. That's fine. But if you make it bigger, if you connect it to the economy, healthcare, social equity, environment, whatever these larger things are that transportation is fundamentally connected to, you've massively expanded the audience that is interested in this all of a sudden. So you've got to articulate a larger goal, the role of transportation in that. And then for the funding sources, I mean, the gas tax is still the workhorse of the system. We've got to have the gas tax being robust and doing what it's doing. We should start aggressively to expand into these other areas. The VMT fees, tolling, there's all kinds of things. Just open all that up. And then I'm going to punt on the last question about how possible it is to get that done.
You know, I think I would rely on the current foundation that the system is built on. Like I said earlier, the vast majority of the surface transportation funding that's out there now goes out through the formula programs. And then, as Rob pointed out in his presentation, states and localities are really where you're seeing most of the innovation happen out there. So we know that the transportation landscape is going to look different 10 years from now than it does now. But what we also know is this foundation of getting the money out to the states and localities by formula and letting them make the decisions and on what works best in their areas has worked really for the last 50 or 60 years, and it can continue to work for the next 50 or 60 years. So I would build my platform or my piece of legislation around that concept. Get money out the door to states and localities through formulas. Let them make the choices that are necessary. I'd support those programs through a mix of revenue options. As much as we have relied on the gas tax for the last 50 or 60 years, I do think it needs to continue to be a piece of the puzzle moving forward. There should be an increase in the gas tax, I think, at the federal level if you're going to increase revenue or funding for transportation. But I think you're also going to have to start looking at other sources of revenue that you can direct into the Highway Trust Fund. There are freight fees out there that people would consider. There are other funds that are currently collected now that are deposited into the general fund that maybe you can reallocate them to the Highway Trust Fund and dedicate them to transportation investment. So I do think that Congress is going to look at a lot of different options. It's probably too much for us to ask them to double the amount of the federal gas tax in the next couple of years. So I think they're going to probably look at a combination of different revenue sources to bridge that gap. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because as we talked about, you're going to see the use of gasoline decrease over time as we start to power our fleet by different vehicles. So we should be looking at other sources of revenue. VMT should be something that we continue to explore from an experimental standpoint and see if we can make it ready for mainstream in the near future. But it's certainly not going to help us bridge the gap in the next 5 to 7 or 8 years. And I can't even remember what the third part was, so I don't think I'm going to answer that one either.
He's punting too.
Have one here.
Good morning, I'm Michelle Muir. I'm with the Department of Commerce here in North Carolina. And I have a question about one of every state's struggles is how to bridge the rural and urban divide. And when we start talking about VMT, in rural communities, they have significant challenges, further commutes to employment, to education, to healthcare, combined with higher rates of unemployment, lower household incomes. Are there any discussions happening on these kind of federal policy levels about whether or how to mitigate those factors in implementation of VMT?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I would say after privacy, that's the number two concern that we hear from folks is, you know, what does this mean to rural communities where residents in those communities are traditionally driving longer distances? You know, what I would say is that the technology exists right now that you could set up a VMT where maybe you're charging lower rates in those areas so that if you're in a rural area where the average trip is much longer than, say, in an urban area, your per mile fee is lower than it is in urban areas. And the technology exists right now to be able to do that. Essentially, it's either time of day or location pricing of the system. You know, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves on VMT. I mean, a lot of us in the transportation community are spending a lot of time talking about it. But I always try to caveat it with the fact that there are so many challenges associated with implementing it. Not just the privacy or the rural versus urban challenges that we've talked about, but also kind of the structural challenges associated with collecting revenue. Right now, the gas tax model allows us to collect something like 80% of the revenue from, you know, 10 or 12 sources. I mean, because the tax is charged at what's called the rack, essentially when the companies come and take it from the facility to put it in the filling stations, you have a very limited number of folks that you have to collect that tax from. If we go to an approach where we're collecting taxes from individuals, I mean, that makes it much harder from an administrative standpoint to bring that revenue in. So in addition to these privacy concerns and challenges or rural versus urban challenges, there's a huge administrative challenge that we're going to have to work through and figure out. And you know, I don't know if that's a challenge that we'll be able to overcome, but it's certainly something that we need to continue to look at and to explore to see if it's one of those options we should consider.
I'm going to exercise my moderator's prerogative and ask you something that I've been hearing from a lot of folks. And it's a question about states using innovative financing tools in combinations, like especially for big projects. You know, of course, we have existing revenue sources, but I'm talking about combinations that may not have been used so far, you know, where we have, you know, tolling revenues, we have debt, you know, in bonds, we have public-private partnerships or equity, you know, in exchange for part of the revenue stream, you know, and there's a cultural aspect to mixing those that, you know, in different states, you know, some states, you know, are just getting going on tolling, whereas in other parts of the country, it's been there for a generation. Public-private partnerships, you know, can freak people out. So if you all would, you know, if we're going to leverage these different sources, and these are old as time, I mean, to biblical times, people have been owning roads or using debt to pay for roads, but can you speak to that?
There's probably an oversimplification, but I think that there's kind of two different ways that we're financing projects. One is the traditional way, and then one is the way that mixes all those things together. So when we see public-private partnerships, they're often coupled with all those different funding and financing options. Private activity bonds almost always accompany a lot of these P3 deals. And if you're using tolling, that changes the revenue source, and so you're able to take different advantage of things like innovative loan programs and things like that. The public-private partnerships come in then when there is a revenue source like a toll road. There are ways you can do things like availability payments, and we can get into all that, but tolling facilities are very attractive as a private venture because there's a clear revenue source that they can count on. When they do that, and when you get the private sector involved, they do everything that you're talking about. They're finance experts. They know how to pull those levers. They know how to bring in all these different sources. And so in my head, there's two different types. It's traditional and then everything that is.
No, you see in P3s with where revenue sources are not necessarily tolls, like where they're ridership on transit or other things?
Rarely. I mean, you do see some of those. There are a couple of good examples of P3s for transit. There's a project in Maryland, there's a project in Colorado, but they're more the exception than the rule.
Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another example of how states are innovating, right? I mean, state DOTs are not the same as they were 50 years ago. You know, they're being forced to be creative and be innovative, and that's a great thing. And it's one of the reasons that we love this kind of federal-state partnership, because we think that states and localities are probably better suited to be creative and innovative than the federal government. I will say this is an area probably where the federal folks are encouraging this type of innovation from a public-private partnership standpoint and creative financing. And I think we are seeing it in a lot of different projects. One thing I think that we have to do is maybe rethink what we define as a public-private partnership, because we talk a lot about these big toll projects as P3s, and they're great examples, and they are a must today when we're struggling to find the revenue and the funding that we need to operate the system. But states are being creative in other ways in bringing the private sector in. Rob showed this value capture approach where you're building a transportation facility and then maybe capturing some of that additional tax revenue that's produced in the future based on that transportation facility. We're seeing partnerships with the private sector for highway lighting and doing contracting in a more innovative way. We're seeing contracts with the private sector to operate and maintain facilities that traditionally in the past have been done by state departments of transportation or localities. So that kind of partnership with the public sector and the private sector doesn't have to just be big toll projects. It can be contracts for maintenance agreements. It can be an agreement to maintain and install highway lighting. It can be examples where, like in the state of Pennsylvania, where they bundled together a group of 500 rural bridges and essentially put them out to bid all together as a way to get some economies of scale associated with that. And they partner with the private sector on the design and engineering associated with those projects, and really have had a lot of success in driving down the kind of per bridge cost for that. But that's a great example of maybe a public-private partnership that we don't normally think about. We think of those big toll projects as most of the P3s.
Yeah, less transactional and more true partnerships.
Exactly, yes.
Well, I'm a wonk. I could keep doing this for a long time, but we have run out of time, and I'm a little disappointed because I've been seeing a bunch of hands go up. So, but I've been informed that our time is up. So I want to thank you guys, Jim and Rob, very much. I've learned a great deal from this, and I hope you all have. So let me, before we final end, let me say that lunch is going to be served in Exhibit Hall C, and let me strongly encourage everybody to check out the exhibits and the vendors. There's some very, very interesting and informative exhibits down there. So please check that out. And so now I want to conclude with a big round of applause for these two gentlemen. And we're now on break. Thank you.